Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. The notion of digital health passports is one that has emerged as a controversial possibility in a number of countries as the world seeks ways of living with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But the question remains, what is the most realistic balance between health protection and enabling economic activity? And what might the world look like if the use of digital health passports is enforced? Leland Shupp is a thought leader, writer, and public speaker, and he has explored the idea of digital health passports in his chapter in the book Aftershocks and Opportunities 2, Navigating the Next Horizon. Lee, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Sure. My name is Leland Shupp. I'm a consulting futurist. I typically work with large corporations. I'm based in Silicon Valley, so I'm right in the middle of the technology revolution. And that has both hyperbole and really cool innovations at the same time. So it's always fun to sort between the two.
Yeah.
I've been doing it for about 20 years. And
right.
I'm one of the founding members of the Association of Professional Futurists, which is now been going about 15 years and it's become international.
I love that idea, the comment you made about the hyperbole and the reality. That's a whole nother podcast, though. Let's tuck in then. And first of all, I really love your provocative scenario in the book. Can you walk us through it? What were the kind of the key points that you wanted to pull out in writing that scenario?
Sure. And the really funny thing about it is that so much of it has come to pass so quickly that I almost feel like the book is history rather than futures. I originally wrote the chapter over a year ago, and because of some delays in publication, I think a lot of the stuff's already happened. So I feel like I didn't push the edges hard enough. What I was thinking about was the need to know if people are vaccinated or not, especially in the US, where we have a very polarized group of people, anti-vaxxers and people who are very pro-vaccination. And to be able to open up the economy, you have to understand where people are at. And that made me quickly think about, you could have two classes of people, those who are vaccinated and have full privileges to go places, much like you're seeing in New York or LA now, or even in Paris, and people that are vaccine resistors who have just limited mobility and limited access to places because they're more dangerous to be around. And that's caused a huge political schism in the US, not surprisingly. But also elsewhere, I've been surprised to see the amount of protests that we've seen in Germany and in France, for instance.
It's interesting, isn't it, how different populations around the world seem to have very different feelings of trust or otherwise in the benefit of vaccinations. What's behind this extreme polarization in the US?
Well, I think a few things. I mean, first, I think we have some of the most active disinformation campaigns ever waged, around the vaccine from various bad actors, both state actors and just conspiracy theorists who just don't know any better. We also have a political party that has really put its weight behind the anti-vax movement, which is really silly when you think about it, because it's not very smart for a political party to have less voting members because they're dying of COVID. Yet here we are.
There's nothing so strange as reality. So how can we best balance the need, do you think, between public health with the desire for personal privacy? Because certainly in Europe and in the UK, we've kind of seen this debate between how much of our liberty are we willing to give up for the greater health good. And, that's still an ongoing debate even now.
It is a tricky debate. And I think Great Britain, to its credit, is much more socially oriented and less individualistically oriented than the US. I see that as a continuum. I think in the US, because we have this sort of frontier ethos and this sort of do-it-yourself, individualism, that's worked against us in some ways.
And this is a bit of an aside, but I'm fascinated by the nature of the polarization in the US. And I saw glimpses of a study recently that showed the different rates of vaccination take up across constituencies that had voted Republican or Democrat, and the Democrat type areas have picked up more of the vaccines. Why is that?
It's fascinating. I'm an avid consumer of the Pew Internet data, and a lot of great data has come from them about the vaccine. Turns out the two biggest predictors of whether you're vaccinated or not are, number one, your news source, if it's Fox News or MSNBC, and your Democrat and your party affiliation, whether it's Democrat or Republican. Some moderate Republicans are starting to come around, but there is a far right wing of the Republican Party that is still very opposed to not only vaccines, but wearing a mask and just very simple things that can be done to stop the spread of the virus.
Yeah,
And to me, it's amazing that a political party would get behind this, would get behind something that is so obviously opposed to public health and just common sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it is completely fascinating. I mean, what personal privacy compromises should we accept in the face of high risk and rising mortality rates? And how can they be undone, do you think?
I've thought about this a lot. I mean, for me personally, I think that I don't see any harm in us being transparent about the vaccinations that we've had. I think that runs from, rubella to measles to polio to COVID to even tetanus. That doesn't really reveal anything about underlying medical conditions. And it makes it very easy for people around us to assess the risk or the reward in having us around. Even for something as simple as working a construction job, if you could walk up with a vaccine passport and said, my tetanus shot is up to date, that would make you a more attractive hire for doing something as simple as construction work. For boarding a plane, I think it's essential that we know if people have been vaccinated.
Do you think potentially this kind of, are you vaccinated, are you not vaccinated, plays into issues of social inclusion, social exclusion? Is there a risk that could exacerbate any existing social divides?
Yes, it already is. It's making very clear divides. I'm a working musician, and I've been very surprised at some of the music venues that I've played at. People found out that there were some people in the audience who were not vaccinated, and they had a lot of social pushback about why were they showing up at a venue and mixing with other people if they weren't vaccinated. So there's a lot of social pressure on people that weren't vaccinated they were not expecting. I mean, conversely, there's been very aggressive behavior from anti-vaxxers against people who are vaxxed. And you see this, all the time. Airline attendants being punched or screamed at, this very virulent reaction to people that are just doing common sense health stuff.
So one of the things you said at the start of this was that you'd written the scenario a year ago, and that one of the things that you've observed is that a number of the things that you were speaking about have actually come to pass. So if you were writing the scenario now, what would it look like in, say, 5 years' time if these ideas around passports had not only applied to COVID, but had potentially started to apply in other areas as well?
Sure. I think, yeah. I was amazed at how fast things came to pass I was writing about. I thought 1 million dead in the US from COVID was a pretty ridiculous number when I wrote it. We're at 800,000 plus now. I mean, according to The Economist, who's measuring excess mortality within the US. So the numbers of people who've died I certainly underestimated. I think in 5 years' time, if we saw an outbreak of Ebola or different strains of COVID that we haven't seen yet, that could definitely drive much more action towards a digital health passport. I think Europe is ahead of the US in this regard. I know it's being debated in Europe, but it feels like it's a lot closer to happening in Europe. In the US, because we have such a decentralized governmental structure, you have governors, as in Florida and Texas, who are actively undermining public health measures. For instance, in Texas, it's illegal to require masks in a school. And several school districts have challenged this, but the idea that a state government would make requiring a mask illegal, to me, is just ludicrous. Yet this is happening. And there are several states that are are doing this. And it's just amazing to me that there's leadership that's doing things that are so contrary to just common sense public health measures.
Again, another side, you're saying things that are just triggering other thoughts in my head. But what does this say about the trust that parts of the US population has in science?
It's amazing to me the lack of trust that we have in science. With friends that I've been joking that we're in a de-Renaissance or de-Reformation, undoing all the gains we made by the scientific revolution that ended the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
I think we're at a place, being centered in Silicon Valley, of course, I've been very optimistic about the internet and about, and I agreed with a lot of the original utopian ideas around the internet. People having access to information would be a great thing. Having, the world's information at your fingertips would be a great thing. What we didn't really think about was internet literacy. And in the same way that media literacy is taught in communications schools now, I think that we're going to have to start teaching algorithmic literacy so that people that are using the internet, and particularly Facebook and other social media platforms, understand that they're reacting to algorithms that are designed to provoke a response, and that it's really about provoking a response and engaging you so that you'll respond to advertising versus giving you truthful or wise information. And so you really have to be smart about how you're consuming information. And now we've come to a place where an article in a scientific journal is equated with a YouTube video from somebody who knows nothing about science. And particularly for less educated Americans, there's just not the filter or the experience and expertise to be able to filter good information from bad information. All information has become equal, and that doesn't make any sense.
You alluded earlier on to the idea that this is the first of potentially other major disruptive pandemics in the future. So what are the lessons you think should be taken away in terms of preparedness? Because as futurists, I guess that's one of the things that we hope that the work we do helps the people we work with come to terms with, not a specific risk perhaps, but a broader preparedness. So, what opportunity, what benefit might you see around preparedness in the future?
So many lessons learned, and I really hope we take them to heart. I think we're learning that we really are in an interconnected global world right now, and that we're going to have to monitor diseases and pandemics really at the source as much as possible. The Obama administration did an admirable job of doing this because they reacted to outbreaks of Ebola in Africa, and they got networks set up and scientists on the ground so that they could try to understand those outbreaks and deal with them locally before they became global outbreaks. The Trump administration pulled funding and attention for a whole lot of that stuff and sort of crippled our systems right at the time we needed them the most. So I think we're going to need better communication, better preparedness. I think it's been a lesson for a lot of our medical systems that they need to be able to respond, much more quickly. I think we need to take these things much more seriously when they first began. I remember reading the first articles about COVID, and as futurists saying, this is going to be a really big deal, when a lot of people are still poo-pooing it. And then it became a big deal even faster than I thought it would be. And I thought it would become a big deal fast. So I think being faster to respond, being more agile to respond, and better funding, smart preparedness are probably the biggest lessons to be learned.
Lee, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your insights. Tell us, how can people contact you, learn more about what you do?
I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter as Lee Shupp. My website is leeshuppconsulting.com. And I am a frequent speaker and blogger.
Well, Lee, thank you once again for your time and sharing your insights. And as I say, it was a brilliant chapter in the book as well.
Thank you, Steve. Much appreciated.
Thank you for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini-pod, and there'll be another episode along very shortly.